Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the Board, and Superintendent Davis. Today, my colleague and I will provide a brief report on Henry County Schools' financial planning and management of the federal funds authorized to support school systems in the midst of a global pandemic. The economic impact of COVID-19 has been staggering. President Donald Trump declared the novel coronavirus a national emergency on March 13, 2020. One day later, Governor Brian Kemp declared a public health emergency for Georgia, and Henry County Schools transitioned to remote learning on March 16th. Daily routines were disrupted, and life as many knew it changed. Schools were closed, church services were canceled, store shelves were emptied, and millions of Americans lost employment. Georgia, like many other states, braced for declines in revenue and significant increases in new costs, including those related to unemployment and health care. Having delayed the 2020 legislative cycle due to the pandemic outbreak, the Georgia legislature passed the FY21 budget, which covered the period of July 1st, 2020 to June 30th, 2021, with a $1 billion cut in funding to Georgia's Department of Education. 95% of that funding, so $950 million, was passed on to all of the 181 local K-12 school systems through the implementation of austerity. For Henry County Schools, the impact of austerity, the loss of the equalization grant, and increased local share contributions resulted in state revenue declines of $41.5 million that year. The federal government responded to the economic crisis many school systems faced by providing elementary and secondary school emergency relief, or ESSER, funding. To date, the federal government has issued 3 rounds of ESSER funding to stabilize the infrastructure for K-12 education, provide resources to allow schools to safely operate, and support implementation of innovative practices to promote student learning. In the subsequent slides, we will review the funds allocated to Henry County Schools specifically, but first, it's important to understand how the funding is granted. When Congress authorizes a bill to provide funding, it first grants it to one of the federal agencies under its control. Accordingly, the ESSER funds are first allocated to the U.S. Department of Education. The U.S. Department of Education will establish the application process and timelines to allocate the funds, as well as set expectations on what programmatic objectives the funds can be used for and what reporting will be required. For the ESSER funds, the U.S. Department of Education leveraged the Title I data to determine how to allocate funds to states in consideration of the needs of the students served. Once the allocation and application methodology is set, the U.S. Department of Education then subgrants funds to state-level departments of education. So in our context, that entity is the Georgia Department of Education, or GDO. GDO is in charge with applying the federal rules for allocating funds down to the local education agencies, like Henry County Schools, and ensuring compliance by operating as a reviewer and to monitor the funds granted to the local school districts. GDO will also prepare processes and guidance to ensure that funds are used for purposes allowed by the federal grant. For example, the Georgia Department of Education outlined categories of acceptable uses of funds to include funds for at-risk student populations, distance remote learning, school meals, mental health and physical health, supplemental learning, facilities and equipment, continuity of core staff and services, and professional development. The state departments then allocate funds to the local education agencies that serve the students directly. And schools, the local education agencies like Henry County Schools, must then define a comprehensive budget on how it will spend the allocated funds prior to having access to those funds. And as a reminder, federal grants generally operate on a reimbursement basis, meaning Henry County Schools must spend the money from its own sources first and then draw down funds for reimbursement periodically. Quickly, this next slide gives just a visual representation of the process we just walked through, showing the top-level ESSER 1 authorization of $13.2 billion, which translated to $457.2 million allocated to GDO, and approximately $5.9 million that was then allocated to Henry County Schools. The subsequent ESSER allocations follow the same process. Henry County Schools' allocation for ESSER 2 was $23.7 million, and the ESSER 3 allocation was $53.4 million. One notable difference between the first ESSER grant and the later 2 grants pertains to the requirement of equitable services. equitable services provisions require Henry County Schools to reach out to private education entities that serve students residing in the geographic boundaries of Henry County to evaluate if those schools require any funding to support those students. When equitable services is applicable, Henry County Schools must allocate a portion of the funds to the participating schools in accordance with the needs profile of the Henry County students they serve. The first ESSER grant required equitable services and therefore a set-aside amount. The second and third ESSER grants did not. I would like to encourage the board and the community to visit the ESSER webpage for more information on the authorizing legislations, the allocation process, and Henry County Schools planning and management practices of these federal funds. We have authored a white paper that explains how the introduction of the ESSER funds have supported our system's response to COVID and supported recovery from deficits. The webpage can be accessed via the main ribbon by clicking ESSER. The white paper is contained on the overview page, but it is also available for download. Now that we've set some context for what the ESSER funds are and the allocation mechanics, we will transition into specifics around Henry County Schools financial planning and management. I'll review the ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 funds, which have both undergone the Godot review and approval process. As a reminder, the ESSER 1 grant to Henry County Schools was $5.9 million, of which $166,000 had to be held back for equitable services to non-public schools that support students that reside in Henry County. To date, approximately 97% of the grant has been expended and drawn down in accordance with the approved budget to accomplish continuity of services, including the nutrition services offered at the outset of the pandemic. ESSER 1, or the CARES funds, were also used to provide summer school services in 2020, as well as to purchase personal protective equipment, cleaning supplies, technology devices, and other instructional materials that were needed to operate school in person and remote during this past school year. The formal spending plan for ESSER 2 funds was coordinated with the planning for the FY22 budget. With the board's passing of the budget in May, we were able to finalize the ESSER 2 plans and submit the budget for Godot approval, which was granted last month. These funds are planned to be expended over the next 2 years through September 30th, 2023. Programmatic goals of the ESSER 2 funds include covering the costs of the summer 2021 recovery programs we heard about earlier, including our ability to offer aftercare programs to families at no cost, and providing that extended enrichment to more than 350 elementary students. Purchasing additional devices, software, and other instructional materials to support FY22 launch. This includes a $2,500 allocation to each school to support purchase of instructional materials that they identify locally. Completing facility improvements that support enhanced air quality and purchasing materials to continue COVID-19 mitigation as outlined in the district playbook. This includes allocations to each school of $2,000 for the purchase of PPE and cleaning materials. Finally, these funds will support the budgetary shortfall identified with the adoption of the FY22 budget and resolve the deficits incurred by offering nutrition and aftercare services to students during the course of the pandemic. I will now turn the report over to Melissa Morse, who will outline the planning efforts underway for ESSER 3 funds authorized by the American Rescue Plan in preparation for the Godot submission.
Thanks, Shanika. Forgive me for that. Madam Chair, members of the board, Madam Superintendent, this may look familiar to you. In April, I did share with you the initial planning that was underway for our ESSER 3 that we commonly refer to as our ARPA comprehensive plan. You'll remember that this flow chart was about really smartly establishing how we would go about building our ARPA comprehensive plan as well as implementing and monitoring that plan. So we really have spent the last 3 months living in this first box to develop the plan based on the input from our school community and then determining what those needed investments needed to be. So as Shanika just explained, we will apply for these funds from the Georgia Department of Ed and have access to these funds really in 2 phases, which is also a little different from the other 2. Currently, we are going to be able to apply for and access 2/3 of the funds in a phase 1, with the balance of those funds available to us at a phase 2, which is a date to be determined. Now, one of the good things is, since my last report, we do have confirmation that we have an extra school year in which we can invest these funds. So that means that we are going to be able to have the ability to support 3 school years, and now with 1 summer over, 3 summers. So the comprehensive plan that we've developed up to this point is for this first 2/3 allocation, or phase 1. So in order to build this comprehensive plan, we solicited really great creative thinking under the leadership of 4 district investment steering teams who gathered teachers, school support personnel like counselors and academic coaches, school administrators, as well as district leaders. These leaders were tasked with detailed brainstorming, asking them to dream big about what we need to be able to support our students, and to be able to make recommendations within one of our themed investment buckets for ARPA. In addition, all employees were provided a needs assessment survey that went out to everybody so that everyone in the organization would have an opportunity to share great ideas for how we ought to invest and get feedback from all of our job families and not just a subsection. We did receive 265 responses from across the district back in May that was also then able to influence what we would do as we made recommendations. So after we gathered all of this information, that steering team put together and prioritized the investments for this phase 1. So seen here are the final investment recommendations, and they are organized by what we call the buckets that will get incorporated into the plan that will be submitted to Georgia DOE for approval. So many of these are going to look familiar to you because we talked about quite a few of them when we had our initial discussion back in April. But just to highlight a few, in learning environments, you will see those elementary schools get the gym ventilation enhancements. In our student wellness and mental health bucket, you'll see those facilitators along now with resources to support their work and an opportunity for a grant program for schools to apply for within the district to be able to take their innovative and creative ideas that they have for supporting student wellness at their schools and access those funds through a grant process. In our investment bucket for return to campus, you'll see the addition of temporary teachers' aides intended to support our elementary schools in order to support those first grade teachers. Because as Dr. Nutt shared in her concern, unlike in the past, we are going to have many students come to campus for the very first time as a first grader, having missed that key kindergarten year where they learn their rituals and routines. That didn't happen. And now that's going to happen when they're in the first grade. So these temporary assistants are going to be able to help us get through the first few months of school with these young learners to be able to help address that. And then lastly, but certainly not least, on the far right-hand side is the investment bucket for accelerated learning to ensure that any interruption is addressed. Now, added to this bucket to sit next to the resources for literacy and college and career readiness we discussed previously is really a team of teachers to support all students who have had to be quarantined as a result of COVID contact tracing. This is going to allow teachers to only have one teaching mode, not trying to teach hybrid, but still provide live digital support for students who need to keep learning while they are quarantined. And then, like student wellness, allocations are also going to be able to be provided to schools for acceleration programming based on their needs. So as Shanika previously shared, once we submit our plan and budget to the state for approval in the next couple of weeks, upon that approval, we'll then be able to begin spending from phase 1. The other parts of this flow chart then at that point get into effect, our implementation and then our very purposeful accountability for the effectiveness and monitoring the effectiveness of these investments. And when school starts then, we're going to be able to see what challenges we're actually facing when we get our students back into the building. And so we will begin the process again at the top to determine how the remaining funds in phase 2 should be allocated in order to be able to meet the needs of what we discover once we have students come back to school in August. And it's also at this time that we're going to be able to ensure that our families and our community have an opportunity to weigh in, be able to share with us what they are experiencing that may need to have investments to be considered in this next phase of the process. And I am really proud, just quickly, to share that districts from around the country have actually been reaching out to us who are interested in how we have developed this ARPA plan. And I really credit that to all of you for expecting us to have a transparent and thorough planning process as we approach the investment to support learning really in an unprecedented time. And then again, just to close, Shanika shared about the website as well, but I do want to make sure you understand that this ESSER website that's available on the Henry County website is being continuously updated so that as additional information is available, we're posting it to our website so that our public is able to follow along with the process that we're making towards these investments in student learning. So Madam Superintendent, that concludes our report, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Ms. Morris and Ms. Clay. Madam Chair, that concludes what we have prepared and remain available for any discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Davis, and thank you so much, Mrs. Clay and Mrs. Morris, for that great report. Does any board member have any questions or comments? Ms. Pope?
Yes, thank you both for that report. I always appreciate how transparent and clear everyone is so that our community understands how this process works because it's so new for all of us. I am so excited about all of these new resources and the ways, I'm grateful for the funding and the ways that they will support all of our students. And, you know, we talk a lot about learning gaps, but I'm also excited for how these resources will also ensure that our students who are on target and who did have a full school year last year, thanks to some wonderful support of families, will also continue to receive enrichment opportunities. And I know that a lot of that is thanks to these new resources. So I'm super excited about what's to come and how these are going to affect our students. I am especially excited about this writing and word work resource acquisition because I know that this has been a big hot topic for our board for several years now, and I'm really looking forward to that.
Thank you, Mrs. Pope. Any other questions or comments from board members? I would like to actually echo what Mrs. Pope said about just the transparency of all of this. For you taking the time to explain it to us, but then not only that, taking the extra step to have it accessible to our community. And, you know, like she also said, this is new to everyone. And so just the level of transparency and detail that you all have put forth is just remarkable. So thank you all for your hard work in this. Thank you for that report.